It may be August, but don't tell that to biotech's company creators. 13 venture rounds washed onto the beach last week, bringing in nearly $800 million, a potential challenger to Amgen's blockbuster Tepezza, another cross-border NewCo, and something new from CAR-T wonderkind George Schett. You're listening to the latest BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here at BioCentury, joined today as ever by our editor-in-chief, Simone Fishburne, Lauren Martz, executive director of Biopharma Intelligence, senior biopharma analyst Danielle Golovin, and biopharma analyst Lindsay Martin. Beyond Venture, we'll discuss 5 approaches to drug cancer's so-called undruggable beta-catenin pathway, and Capricor, which has had anything but a relaxing day at the beach when it comes to the white water it's encountered at FDA during the McCary era. Will the biotech's latest regulatory move give its DMD therapy new life at the agency? All right, first up, let's turn to Lindsay, who is most certainly not reporting from the beach. You can tell where I wish I was. I usually spend my beaches at the Jersey Shore, but not so right now. And Lindsay is safely ensconced in Tennessee, far from the jellyfish. Lindsay, we're fond of the term aggressively August here at BioCentury when it comes to biotech news. It's a term coined by our research director, Meredith Durkin-Wolf, who is really the woman behind the scenes here at BioCentury, keeps everything together and reading smart, filled with great data. So aggressively August, we like these quiet days when all the Europeans are off just hanging out and sipping wine and not working and not giving us news. But last week, Lindsay, venture. What did you find?
That's right. I wish I were at the beach too, Jeff. I grew up in Florida, so I missed that. But yeah, despite being August, we actually had a pretty big week last week with at least 13 rounds, bringing in $791 million. And the biggest round of the week went to Vidaris, a Swiss company. So they're not on holiday right now. And they have an oral allosteric AKT inhibitor for a rare disease, HHT, that's currently in phase 3, with crossover investors, TCGX and Goldman Sachs leading the round. This really brings our third quarter total to about $6.5 billion. So that's quite a lot considering we're still in August. Compared to the first half of the year, we had $19 billion raised in the first half for our venture rounds. So we're about a third of the way there, and we're still in August.
Tell us about Cardis. They've got this oral answer to Tepezza, Lindsay. What's going on there?
Yeah, Cardis is launching with an oral IGF-1R inhibitor that's going to challenge Tepezza. And Tepezza is Amgen's blockbuster for thyroid eye disease. They brought in $576 million in revenue in the second quarter of this year, and that's up from $505 million in the second quarter of last year. But patients that are receiving this drug get it intravenously, so having an oral option would be a lot more convenient. And Cardis's IGF-1R inhibitor is currently preclinical, but they raised $50 million in Series B funds led by Forge Life Sciences last week.
One of the interesting things here, just for context, of course, is that Amgen got this asset, Tepezza, in their acquisition of Horizon. I think that was $28 billion in 2022. And what was interesting there is really Horizon went after an indication that no one was going after. They sort of created that market, as it were. They found an indication and they massively grew it. And now what's interesting is that they've done that, they've shown the market, and now you've got competitors coming in. And, you know, when Amgen bought Horizon, it did have Krystexxa already on the market, and it had other things in development. But, you know, Tepezza was definitely the sort of cornerstone of that deal and where most of the value was.
Yeah, I want to give a little shout out to Foresight as well. Cardis spent its infancy in the Foresight Labs program operated by its Series A investor, Foresight Capital. Lindsay, we also had Boulevard, the Deerfield management startup. What do you got on them?
That's right. Boulevard Bio launched last week, and they are now the 14th new company in licensing assets from Asia and forming companies in the West. And our new co model, as we call it, is also taking on more of a hybrid spin. And this company fits into an example of one of those hybrid new cos where they're in licensing assets from Asia, but they're also in licensing assets from the US or companies in the US, or potentially multiple different companies globally. And so Boulevard Bio launched with a bispecific targeting BAFF in April that was incubated by Deerfield in their Deerfield Discovery Unit. They also in-licensed a preclinical trispecific antibody targeting BCMA, CD19, and CD3. And Boulevard was co-founded by George Shett, who's famous for his CAR T cell research, but the company itself is not aiming to do CAR Ts, but is planning to work in the I&I space.
Yeah, Lauren, what do you think of that? That initially kind of threw us off. We're like, okay, we're going to get a cool CAR T company here out of George Shett. What's your take?
Yeah, it did throw us off. And I think it made us wonder, is this George Shett backing the T cell engager approach to B cell depletion? Because they do have one of those in the pipeline. Or, maybe is it an IP issue because he's a clinical investigator who's used different CAR T constructs, I guess. But I really didn't get a straight answer from the company. I think that this is just sort of him getting behind a company that's working on B cell depletion and B cell targeted therapies in general. Something interesting that the CEO told me about the lead program is that so we have a ton of activity in IgA nephropathy, specifically with APRIL and BAFF inhibitors. But a lot of those are fusion proteins. I think pretty much everything in the pipeline right now is a fusion protein, which acts differently than an actual bispecific antibody that targets both of those with different arms. So that was one interesting differentiation. And then for the trispecific B cell depleter, that seems to be differentiated by the size of the antibody therapy, which I heard is smaller than some of the others in development, which would help it get more into sort of the tissues where you want to deplete the B cells than maybe some of the larger bispecific or trispecific structures.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lauren. On the trispecific, it's definitely a hot space right now, especially for targeting BCMA as well. And Sanofi purchased a trispecific T-cell engager from Cali in March. And then Candid Therapeutics, another new co in licensing assets from Asia, also has a trispecific T-cell engager. And Candid was acquired by UCB earlier this year.
Yeah, and that's, of course, was Ken Song's company. Ken, serial entrepreneur. Candid was an interesting one in its own right in that I know you've mentioned the hybrid thing. This sort of maybe predates that, but they kind of grabbed a few assets from Epimab and another company as well. Ken Song and Derek, his partner in crime, I think have gone back to Venrock now. And who knows, maybe they'll start investing in some new cos on their own. And then just one figure for context, Lindsay mentioned we had our 14th new co, and that's this year, which I think would make this year by far and away the most active for newcos. Is that right, Lindsay?
Yeah, Jeff, that's right. And then speaking of newcos, today, Slate Medicines, which launched in February in licensing antibody from Darts Bio in China, just announced that they are going to reverse merge with the NASDAQ-listed Fulcrum Therapeutics. Fulcrum last month discontinued their phase 1 therapy for sickle cell disease. So it looks like they're now looking to fill their pipeline via the reverse merger.
That's pretty quick, right? From NewCo to reverse merger onto NASDAQ, yeah?
Yeah, but they're not the first company to actually do this in terms of newcos. So other newcos that have gone public via reverse merger include Yarrow, reverse merging with Vine, and then more recently, Serafa and Boundless Bio. And so this makes the third reverse merger to take a NewCo public. This is also among a host of other exits for NewCos this year. So like we just discussed, UCB buying Candid, but then we also had a Gilead buying Oro and the IPOs of Braveheart and Kylera.
Excellent. And NewCos will be one of the several themes at BioCentury and Bay Helix's upcoming China Healthcare Summit. It'll be our 13th, Shanghai, right as November kicks off the Investors Roundtable. The focus will be beyond NewCo, reinventing venture strategies for a new era in biopharma. So that should be one of several good panels. And now this.
This episode of BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 13th China Healthcare Summit, taking place November 2nd to 4th in Shanghai. Everyone has an opinion about China biotech, but there's a difference between reading about cross-border deals and seeing it for yourself. The 13th China Healthcare Summit brings you to Shanghai November 2nd to 4th for a first-hand look at China's innovation moment. Join BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company for a deep dive into China's biopharma ecosystem and meet the biotech leaders who are driving all the news flow. Sourcing innovation, building NewCos, generating faster clinical data, reimagining your R&D strategy. For a dozen years, the China Healthcare Summit has gathered the right people to network and build business. Now it's your chance to be in the room. Join us in Shanghai this November. Opt into the tour of Suzhou and a visit to Shanghai Clinical Trial Centers. See it for yourself. Register at biocenturychinasummit.com.
And we're back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Let's turn to Danielle Golovin. She took a look at a few different approaches to drugging the beta-catenin pathway. What did you learn, Danielle?
Yeah, so it's been known for a long time now that the Wnt pathway is overactive in several cancers. The problem has been figuring out how to drug it safely. So the Wnt pathway is essential in healthy physiological signaling for stem cell turnover. So hitting upstream parts of the pathway, like Wnt itself or its receptors, cause a lot of toxicities, particularly causing bone damage, intestinal injury, etc. Basically, we couldn't separate the cancer signal from the healthy signal if you're blocking the whole pathway. Then scientists thought, let's go downstream. Maybe we could inhibit parts of the pathway that are specifically overactive in oncogenic signaling. So this would potentially leave physiological signaling intact. What sparked this story is there's now 5 programs in the clinic targeting a downstream component of the pathway called beta-catenin. But the really interesting part when I started digging in is that they all chose a different way to do it. Targeting beta-catenin itself is hard because its interface is flat, so it doesn't have the conventional binding pockets that small molecules require. One big unlock here was to use cell-penetrating peptides to bind beta-catenin. So 2 companies took that track, and the other 3 companies ended up using small molecules, which don't interact with beta-catenin directly because, again, there's no pocket to bind, but still affect the pathway.
So how do the peptides work, Danielle? And what are the sort of key companies that are players in this field?
Yeah, starting with the peptides, as I mentioned, there's 2 companies that took that route. That's Parabilis and Sapiens. Parabilis produces cell-penetrating peptide macrocycles called helicons. And when I talked to the company, they likened it to intracellular antibodies, which are capable of engaging flat protein surfaces. Sapiens' peptide is built from D amino acids. So these are the mirror image isomers of naturally occurring amino acids. And the advantage there is that it helps to evade protease degradation. So both these peptides, even though they both hit beta-catenin, they actually hit completely different spots on the protein. So Parabilis' peptide sits in the exact site where TCF would normally dock, that's transcription factor, that actually sits on the DNA and turns on the Wnt target genes. So arguably the most downstream node in the pathway. Parabilis CEO Matai Mammon told me that they chose the interaction because of dependency mapping screens flagged it as the real cancer dependency in this pathway. So dependency map or DEP-map is a data set from the Broad Institute. They run CRISPR screens across more than 1,000 cancer cell lines, systematically knocking out genes and interactions one at a time to see which ones the cancer cell actually can't survive without. And this was the node that came up. They have strong conviction based on that DET map data. Now, Sapiens's peptide, on the other hand, binds a different surface entirely on beta-catenin, which is its ARM1 domain. That's used by BCL9, but not by TCF. So BCL9's role is to retain beta-catenin in the nucleus, protecting it from degradation. Sapiens' CEO Barry Capel told me that that was purposeful to avoid the TCF interaction because he believes that the beta-catenin TCF interaction is necessary to maintain the physiological signaling. There's a tension there with, the two different peptide methods. But I will say that Parabilis does have early clinical data showing no major toxicities so far. And actually that data fueled the biggest pure play biopharma NASDAQ IPO ever in June.
All right, Danielle, let's look at the small molecule side and who the players are there.
For the small molecules, each one goes after a different partner protein or process. So in the case of Iterion, they block a cofactor called TBL1 that normally protects nuclear beta-catenin from being degraded. Now, Eisai and Prism's molecule blocks beta-catenin's interaction with a cofactor called CBP specifically. This leaves its close relative P300 alone, and that biases the cell toward differentiation rather than proliferation. And I would say dew point is probably the most different of the five. It targets 4 regulatory proteins that control where beta-catenin sits in the cell. And the effect is trapping it inside inactive nuclear condensates. They call it a condensate modulator or CMOD. And I would say on the lines, stringing this all together, because the crux of the story is to avoid the toxicity that, first generation molecules had. Dew point has one of the clearest examples. Their condensate trapping is concentration dependent. So it will only grab excess beta-catenin, and that's only happening in cancer cells. So it actually leaves the normal baseline levels in healthy cells alone.
Sounds good. And I know you mentioned a little bit of data already. Do all these companies have data yet?
Yeah, so they're all early in the clinic. The two furthest along, I would say, are Parabilis and Sapiens. So Parabilis, as I mentioned, went public in June, and they're planning to start a global phase 3 in desmoid tumors in the first half of next year. And Sapiens also has strong phase 2 combination data in colorectal cancer and is moving toward a bigger randomized phase 2B. Iterion is in phase 1/2. Eisai and Prism are phase 1/2. They both have some early data. And then dew point is in phase 1, and we're awaiting that data, which I think should come by the end of the year, at least the biomarker data.
All right. And if you're curious, you can check out Danielle's story on biocentury.com. I'll drop a link in the show notes. And Danielle, I trust you'll continue to watch his data emerge. Obviously, we've been following what Matai's been up to for some time now here at BioCentury. So always exciting when companies make it to phase 3. We will continue to watch. Also exciting when a company gets to go in front of FDA, which unfortunately Capricor's done a few times now. The company last week announced that it was going to refocus how it's approaching its BLA. Our colleague Meredith wrote a piece on this on Friday. Lauren's here, as she's been following a lot of these regulatory decisions, especially some of those that had some rough water under the McCary era. Capricor is certainly one of these. Lauren, what did you find?
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, Capricor has definitely had a long road to this phase 3 data and new regulatory submission after receiving a CRL last year. So one thing that was interesting about this program, so Capricor is developing cardiosphere-derived cells to treat DMD. And the company was seeking an approval for DMD cardiomyopathy, which is something that does not have any approved drugs. All of the approved drugs for DMD that we have are, approved for the indication in general. But the cardiomyopathy, the impact on the cardiac muscle, is actually what often leads to death, and severe consequences in these patients. So it was an effort to try to get an approval in this indication. It was the secondary endpoint in the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And there's been just a long line of controversy about whether there was actually a statistically significant impact on cardiac function in both of these trials. And ultimately, there was an advisory committee meeting which is great that we've held it, but that voted against approval for the cardiomyopathy indication specifically. But now we've just heard that the company is going to pursue an approval just for DMD for improving limb function.
One issue with that advisory committee meeting, I guess to back up a step, after the CRL, there were good data in December that drove the stock up dramatically. Investors were excited about both the primary and secondary endpoint data. Fast forward then to the advisory committee. The advisory committee only voted on whether the therapy had demonstrated efficacy in cardiomyopathy, rejected that 9-3. The CEO, Linda Marbon, on an investor call on Thursday evening of last week, said this. I feel like it's only fair to just put it out there what she had to say. It is worth noting that in a separate discussion on upper limb function during the AdCom, the committee's feedback was directly supportive of the clinical evidence for the primary endpoint in upper limb function. So that's the company's take. That's the route they're going. There's a PDUFA date, I believe this week. We're expecting that to get extended now that the deck has sort of been shuffled. Lauren, any further thoughts here?
No, but thanks, Jeff. That's a good point. I think there was a lot less controversy around whether or not these cells are helping patients' skeletal muscles function. That's, hopefully a positive, just a positive signal for FDA's willingness to sort of work with the company and find a path forward. And this works very differently than I think any of the approved therapies for DMD. So hopefully it's something that would complement what's available.
Certainly an indication with a great deal of unmet need. Well, just a quick heads up, it is back to school time, and I don't just mean Danielle's kids starting kindergarten and my kids dragging themselves very slowly out of bed. It's back to school, the 34th edition of BioCentury's signature issue. Every year we take a look at a really significant issue facing the industry, and we take a forward-looking look at what's happening there. And this year, the theme, first in human studies. Simone, quick little tease for folks.
So I don't think it's controversial to say this is one of the hottest topics in the industry this year, has been brewing for a while. One of the points that we make in this is that it is not actually the slow timelines for getting first in human trials up and running from the time from a preclinical package. That topic is not new. What's new is the urgency. And China's created the urgency. This is really not a topic about China. It is actually about patients, and it's about first in human studies and how can they be expedited. And so what we've done is we have taken a very global lens on this. And we have a package of stories coming out this week that look in various different countries and regulatory jurisdictions about the levers, or as you would say, levers, I think, that different companies are using, the dials they turn, if you like, the tools they use in order to try and expedite this process. We break it down. It's immensely interesting, and I hope will be useful for people. And then, of course, the capstone at the end of the week, we have an overarching cover story and then all the stories. And there's obviously a nice little smattering of data within that.
Yeah, it's definitely a great read. We have, how many stories do we have? We have about 10 stories for you. We dig into what's happening in Denmark, the UK, Spain, Australia. We'll wander over to Taiwan, of course, China, Korea, the US. It is a package in the sense of it is a old school multi-story, and we're even going to have a podcast on this once the U.S. Labor Day holiday passes and our friends
in Europe. The podcast is the least old school part of it, right?
That actually is, it's a newer school.
New school.
And we will have a podcast coming up for you before the end of summer, hopefully to give you something more to listen to. And with that, I'd just like to say thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you checking out our content here on the BioCentury This Week podcast. And thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra for providing the music for both of our podcasts. Coming up, we'll have our colleague Tierney Baum in conversation with Klaus Romero of CPATH. Check that out on the BioCentury Show late this week. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next week.